Hey everyone, I'm Joseph J. McAllister, and welcome to my show. Today we're going to be drinking coffee and making prints. Today's episode is digital negatives and cyanotypes. Let's watch the show. So let's take a look at some of these pictures that I've selected for digital negatives. So what we're looking for is high contrast images with a lot of detail in them and dark shadows and bright highlights to really make those images stand out. So aside from that, we're just basically looking for things that have a really interesting subject matter that might look interesting as a cyanotype print. Forests and dead trees, macro photography, also structures look really intense as cyanotypes. Also, a lot of antique structures are very interesting, like 1920s, 30s. This is the Queen Mary, so that's like 30s era. This is going to be a really great high contrast image to print. This is, trains and ships and things like that. This obviously has tons of detail in it that will be amazing as a cyanotype. A lot for somebody to look at and really examine. And of course, like Industrial Revolution kind of technology, steam driven, copper and rivets and things like that, and even like the ceiling structures here are very intense. Now this is my basic 8x10 printing template for digital negatives. You can see here that our paper size is 8.5 by 11 with 300 resolution. So the full size of this is the same size as the transparencies, which is standard printer paper size. And this inner red area right here, where we're going to put the picture, is 8 by 10 because that's a standard portrait frame size. And this white line is here around the red square because this is where we're going to cut our image out on the cutting board so that we can fit it into the frame. Now, an 8x10 frame has a 1/4 inch lip, so we're actually going to be seeing only 7.5 by 9.5 inch area. So this is my way of double checking to make sure that the image will still look good once it's in the frame. Now, I also put some step wedges on here to help us with developing. Another thing that is actually really important, more important than a step wedge honestly, is that it says front on here. This is because, being that it's a negative transparency, you can easily lay it down and print it like as a mirror image accidentally. And personally, I just like to keep my images true to reality, so if I read that it says front, I know that it's not backwards. So let's drag some of these images in here and make some digital negatives. Now the next thing I'm going to do is just turn all of these to black and white by reducing the saturation, and just make sure that these images are actually going to look good as a monochromatic image. Sometimes when you take the color out of an image, it's hard to tell what the image is anymore, and it just kind of loses its magic sometimes. Now let's reduce the size of these images and get them to fit inside of this little 8x10 window. So once you've reduced the size of the first one, you can go to the next picture, just hit Control-Shift-T, and it will automatically reduce the next one to the exact same size and position. Control-Shift-T. Control Shift T there. And let's do the same thing on this one. Digital photographs are more of a widescreen image than a traditional 8x10, which is a bit more of a square format. So we're going to have to pan and scan these images and figure out where we want them centered. And that one looks good there. This one maybe about like that. And this one definitely needs to be moved. About like that. Now let's zoom in a little bit and really get a look at these images. They look a lot better once you've zoomed in, but now you can't really see the full thing. But you get a better idea of what you're really printing. Now this image looks great as a digital image just like that, but the problem is that Cyanotype is a very low contrast medium, and it will look very flat and dull and lifeless unless we really bring up the contrast in this digital negative. So let's bring up the contrast in this image and see if we can bring some life to it. And we don't want to have an image that's too light, because the best Cyanotype images are going to be kind of dark and moody, but with a lot of bright highlights. So let's see what we can do with this image and maybe bring it up a little bit. I think just leave it like that and bring up the contrast a bunch on this one. Maybe a little bit more detail. It's good if your whites really reach a true white and your blacks are a true black. And you want to have lots of dark tones throughout. The whites are mainly just going to act as a highlight so you can see the definition and tell what's going on. And so about like that looks pretty good. I think that will print alright. Again, this image looks great as is, but all of this stuff is not going to come out in the final print, and it's going to be really flat unless we really bring up the contrast. And when we do this, we don't want to lose everything into darkness either, but we also want to keep that dark, shadowy, moody kind of style. So another thing is we want to really watch out for just overdoing it and like blowing out all of our highlight detail. And that's about the point that I try to ease it back a little bit. We want to bring the brightest colors up to a true white, but we don't want to lose any of our detail right there. And so kind of just walk that edge right there. About like that's going to be great. And maybe a little more shadowy detail. Now this one looks very high contrast, but you know, these whites really just aren't popping out enough for a cyanotype print. So try and bring it up just a little bit. And also, you know, I think a lot of this detail is not going to come out unless we bring it up just a little bit and reveal some of this shadow detail. So something like that looks pretty good. I think that will work. And this is a very good high contrast image, but this needs to be brought up a little bit too. You can tell that the whites aren't quite white. They're a little bit of an off-white still. And the off-white is not going to print right. It's going to end up with a kind of a dot matrix kind of look on it that doesn't look good. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now we've got a little bit more contrast in this image, and our whites are going to print true white, and our blacks here are going to be true black. And we've got plenty of shadow and mid-tone detail. Okay, now we can pull back and just kind of check and see if our images will look good in the frame. And these look pretty good. So we haven't cut off so much that it's going to distort the image any. And now definitely remember to turn that off before we print, or we're really going to ruin the image. And The last thing we need to do, and this is absolute, do not forget to do this, you've got to make these images negative. If you print all of these accidentally, which I've done before, as positives, and then printed them, and then ended up with all these negative images, and you're really going to be wasting your time. Alright, so let's Control P, go ahead and print these. So you notice that the printer settings are not set up properly, so what we need is a landscape, and make sure that your scale to fit is on, because our image is 8.5 by 11 and our printer paper is 8.5 11. This is exact measurements, 1:1. And go into page setup, and you know your printer setup is probably going to be a little different, but try to look for similar things to do to the image that I'm doing to this one. Go into paper type, this is very important, transparency, and also if you have a print quality setup, see this is only at 600, boost that up to 1200 resolution, which is going to be a higher quality, especially for photos. 600 is more for printing text. And I like to save it as transparency, but I've already saved that default, and that will change all those things when you go into that to exactly what we've already selected. Just go ahead and print and we're done. So now we need to mix our chemicals and make our cyanotype solution. So we'll need potassium ferricyanide and green ferric ammonium citrate and a little bit of oxalic acid. So we've got our gram scale, we've got potassium ferricyanide, our green flake ferric ammonium citrate, oxalic acid, distilled water, some plastic spoons and plastic tubs, and a graduated cylinder. Alright, let's get started. So first let's turn on our gram scale, and we're going to put a tub on there and go ahead and zero that out. We're going to be making 400 milliliters of cyanotype solution, and what we're going to need is our green ferric ammonium citrate, and we're going to need 54.4 grams. So let's start measuring that out. Alright, so now let's put another tub on here, and we're going to zero that out. Okay, so now we're going to need 18.4 grams of potassium ferricyanide. And if you get a little too much in there, just go ahead and scoop some out. Okay, let's take this tub off of here, and we're going to go ahead and put a new tub on there and zero it out. And now we're going to need 2 grams of oxalic acid. And we're going to need 400 milliliters of distilled water. Okay, so now we're just going to put the funnel in there, and we're going to put all of our dry chemicals in first, and then we're going to follow it up by putting in the distilled water. And remember, once the water gets in there, the solution becomes light sensitive. So now that you're done mixing your cyanotype solution, it's still not quite ready to use. First, we're going to shake the bottle to help dissolve the chemicals. And shake it for a good while. I can usually tell if the chemicals are dissolved by tilting it back and forth, and you'll hear the little crystals running through the bottle like sand. And until those are gone, it's not totally dissolved. And now we're going to filter our chemicals just to make sure that they're absolutely pure and ready to use. So we'll take this bottle and put the funnel in there, and we're going to take an ordinary coffee filter from the store, just 1 ply, and put it down in there. And now we're going to take our cyanotype solution, and we're just going to pour it into the funnel. Okay, so now it's time to sensitize the paper, but before we do, I want to talk a little bit about the types of paper that we should be using. First of all, your printed paper is way too thin. You can't possibly use that. High gloss printed paper, on the other hand, is thicker, but with that gloss on there, the Cyanotype solutions are just not going to permeate that gloss layer. Now, Strathmore art paper is one of my personal favorites to use, and with that we're looking for a matte finish and also a heavyweight paper with about 100 to 160 grams of weight. Acid-free is always a nice touch, but for Cyanotype it's an extremely stable compound and we really don't need to worry about acid-free, but if it has it, then that's good as well. And we're also looking for a paper that's 100% all rag paper, which basically means it's 100% pure cotton. This is because alternative process solutions are very sensitive to impurities in the paper and it will cause defects in your print. Now normally I'd turn off all these lights and turn on the red safety lights when working with the light sensitive emulsions, but for this demonstration I'm just going to leave them on. Now you can see here that I have a large sheet of glass on the table, and that just makes it easier when I drag the emulsion across the paper. It's going to come off onto the table, and then really this is just easier to clean up. Now usually when I do this process I'll do about 20 to 40 sheets at a time because you're going to make a lot of mistakes, or there will be a lot of papers that aren't coated right or exposed properly, and it's really a numbers game, a hit and miss when you work with these alternative processes. So let's go ahead and pour this into here. It's about as much as we're going to use. Now what I like to use is a foam brush that you get from like Lowe's paint department. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to dip the brush and we're going to bring it across the paper, and we're going to place our finger here to hold the paper in place. We're going to dip it a second time and drag it across, dip it a third, and then a fourth time. One thing we don't want to do is end up having the brush go across here and be dry, because then it's really going to leave these funny looking streaks in your paper. And then from there, we're going to drag across, all the way across the paper, this direction. And then if it still looks kind of streaky, and it looks like there's still too much emulsion on there, we'll drag it this way, again just as a dry brush, to kind of pull that excess emulsion on there. Alright, drag it across here. Alright, now let's try and get some of that excess off of there by brushing the opposite direction and a little more off there. And now we'll just go ahead and pick it up and set it over here to dry. And now lastly, we're just going to take and clean this surface off and get ready for the next one. Okay, so I don't really have a lot of desk space available, especially for like 40 prints, so what I normally do is just lay out old towels on the cement and then lay the prints on top of the towels to dry. Now let's get these prints into a printing frame. As you can see, I already got this stack of printing frames all ready to go, and it's kind of like a little assembly line. Now what I'm going to do here is just show you really quick the frame that I'm using. These are like $3 at Walmart, and you really can't tell what type of frame it is until you look at the back when you're at the store. But these are really good printing frame to use. They're like 11 by 14. And so basically this is what they look like. So it's a Mainstays frame from Walmart. Now real quick, I want to talk to you about all the layers that I put in. First of all, you want to put in a piece of glass as the back. And then now we need something to keep the light from coming through the back of the picture and exposing it through the back. because that would just fade the entire thing because it's not going through the negative. So this piece of cardboard that came with it works out great. And then next we need a reflective layer, because the light's actually going to come through the negative and then it's going to bounce and come back out again. That's going to give it 2 chances to expose the emulsion, and that means that it will expose a lot quicker. Alright, and next we're going to put our sensitized paper down and of course put the negative on there. And then lastly, we're going to sandwich that in with the piece of glass. And there it is, all ready to go. Now I want to take a minute and talk about exposure. Now the first thing you're going to see when you put the cyanotype print out in the sun is you're going to see it turn a dark blue color. And then after that it'll start phasing light green and then light blue, light green and light blue over and over again until it works its way to about a medium gray color. Now at that point the shadows are fully exposed and the chemical is completely exhausted. But what we're not seeing beneath the negative is the midtones and the highlights, which at this point are still not exposed. So this is when it gets tricky because you can't visually tell when the cyanotype has reached its full exposure. So this is why we expose 8 to 10 cyanotypes at a time. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one of those cyanotypes and bring it into the darkroom and put it in the water, and we're going to gauge our time exposure based on what we see. Now a general rule of thumb for exposure times would be 8 to 15 minutes. Now as you can see, I just have some of the room lights on. It's not too bright in here. I definitely don't want sunlight coming in here and exposing this print any further. Now this is how our developing area is going to be set up. The first bath is going to be straight water, and that's our developing tray. The second bath is toning, and that's water mixed with about 10 to 15% hydrogen peroxide. And you really don't have to measure this. You just kind of dump some in. And the third station is where we lay our print, and we're going to fold the towel over it and just kind of pat it to dry it. Now for developing, we're going to be using straight water. It's not necessary to use distilled or purified water to do this. Now it's best to use cold water for this. The cooler the water temperature, the slower that these images will develop. And these images are already going to develop extremely fast. Now here's how the cyanotype looks before we put it in the bath. Now when we put this cyanotype in the bath, we have to swish the water over it really fast. Otherwise there will be a line through it where one side was wet and the other side was dry. Alright, so we can relax a bit as our print develops, but first I want to talk to you about our goal while developing this image. So we want the highlights to turn white and the grays to turn a dark solid blue. So I want you to be watching your highlights lighten and your shadows darken. And the most important part is those dark blues. You need to pull the print intuitively before the blues start to fade. Because once the image fades, you're going to have a dull, low contrast image. Alright, I'm just going to gently agitate the water and let the print develop slowly. We're starting to see some really good highlights, and don't worry about those greens because we're going to light tone those away. Now those dark blues are getting really close and it's just about time to pull the print. At this point they look pretty solid, so I'm just going to pull the print and let it drip. Alright, so the print's looking really beautiful, and we've got some really good solid uniform shadows. Alright, so I'm just going to go ahead and dip this in the toning bath, and it only takes a split second, so just go ahead and pull it out the second the entire print has turned dark blue. So this is turning out to be a really great print. Now I'm just going to go ahead and fold this towel over and pat it dry. We ended up with a really great print, although it does need a little light toning. Alright, so I'm out here in the yard exposing it to the sun to get rid of these greens, and they disappear really quick. Okay, so let's go through a few of these that I printed this weekend. Now, first of all, this print I really like. It hasn't been pressed yet, but it's a beautiful print. It's got plenty of contrast, good lights and darks and midtones, lots of detail. And what I really like too is it's got really deep blues and just perfect detail. Now this one, as you can see, is just really awesome. It's got tons and tons of detail going on, lots of shelves and floorboards have great detail, and these drawers and lots of things to look at there. And here's one of the upper decks of the Queen Mary. And this one turned out pretty well. Maybe a little bit dark, but I think it's got a really deep blue color to it, and it's pretty good. Sometimes I just shoot something and print it to see what it would look like in Cyanotype, because you can never really tell until you do it. And this is some rocks, and then we've got some water rushing up down at Sunset Beach, and in color you could tell a lot more what it is, but it looks pretty good as a Cyanotype too. It's interesting. And here's a model ship at the Los Angeles Maritime Museum, and there's a lot of beautiful detail here and lots to look at. And I really like how there's a reflection of it, because there was a mirror behind the case too, and you can see the backside, and there's just a lot to look at there and really good contrast and definition. And here's right behind it the pier, and there's a lot of beautiful stuff to look at here. The little ripples in the water. I always wonder about how water is going to look as a cyanotype, because it seems like it would make perfect sense for you to make a blue and white image of water. So a lot of cool stuff to look at here, just really amazing. Lots of detail, beautiful boats going on. Now here's the view at Sunset Beach, right off the freeway next to the Getty Villa Museum. And this one I thought would be really interesting. You can see the clouds in the sky, and you can see like all these buildings and things off in the distance are kind of interesting. But two, I really wondered what the ocean would look like as a cyanotype. So that looks pretty good. It's pretty interesting. So that's the way that I weed through these, and Cyanotype is really hit and miss, and you're going to make some that you're going to put into your portfolio, and then other ones that you're going to take off to the side and you're going to say, I don't quite want people to see these yet, I can do better, I can rework these. Because what they say about alternative process is no two prints are the same, and that basically means it's kind of a wild card. You never know how any print is going to turn out until it's completely done. And it's not a Xerox machine, and it's not a digital camera, and every photo is not going to be exactly alike. They're all going to be different, and the emulsions are going to be different, the exposures are going to be different, and it's going to be good and bad. And you just kind of weed through those, and you end up eventually printing your whole batch and ending up with a lot of great images to show.